Good morning. Kicking it off this morning, I was doing a little bit of looking and I found a couple of articles, and it wasn't necessarily the articles themselves, it was their placement. Literally their physical placement, which triggered this thought and brought me back to a couple of things that I've heard. Fate can be kind of weird sometimes. Be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and let's get started. The Army is too top heavy. Most senior Army officers are turning down command consideration. So we're top heavy, but most of the senior officers in the Army are turning down the command consideration. So are we truly getting the best of the best in the command? And maybe the bureaucracy is just a little bit too big. Getting into both of these stories, it reminded me of a while back. I came familiar with this video regarding why U.S. generals were more successful in World War II. This is only a minute or two out of this presentation, which of course will be linked.
It is forgotten by most people, though I hope not the people in this room. World War II began with a wave of firings. It was a kind of cleaning, house cleaning across the military that would astonish people if it occurred today. 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor, the two top commanders in the Pacific, Admiral Kimmel and General Short, were fired. Kimmel, by the way, anybody know who replaced him? Nimitz. Yeah, come on. It's a gimme, guys. He was replaced at the end of December 1941 by Chester Nimitz. Also gone from Honolulu was Major General Frederick Martin, who had been the air commander under General Short. On the European front, the Americans banged into the Germans in North Africa. Not long afterward, the senior tactical commander for the Americans, Major General Lloyd Fredendall, is canned. Meanwhile, back in Washington, Marshall is finishing up his winning of the officer corps. Of all the senior leaders of the Army who led the Army in the 1930s, who did the Louisiana maneuvers, for example, only one, in addition to MacArthur, who was really out of the Army during that period, he was in the Philippines, only one got command, General Kruger. None of the other senior commanders survived into combat command.
And as you can see, that's from a very bloated command. If this will be linked, and he goes through more specifically the size of the officer corps in the 1930s, and that General Marshall came in with a plan to whittle down the officer corps, which he thought was bloated with ineffective officers who occupied positions they did not deserve. Speaking of which,
we have right now, I think, 43, could be 44. It's usually 43 or 44.
it's 44.
4-star generals and admirals. You have to think about that. We have a force of 1.1.
It seems like a lot.
Well, let me explain just how much it is. We have 1.12 million people in the armed forces. In other words, you add up all the armed services, that 1.12 million. In World War II, at the height of the war, end of 42, beginning of 43, when we had 12.2 million men under arms, we had 7 4-stars. 7 4-stars. I can tell you who they were. You had George Marshall, Chief of Staff of the Army, Douglas MacArthur commanding in the Pacific, Eisenhower commanding in Great Britain in the European theater, Hap Arnold for the Air Force. Unofficially, he was the vice chief, but he was effectively commanding the air forces. And then you had Leahy, who was in the White House, Admiral Leahy as the liaison officer. He was effectively the unofficial chairman of the Joint Chiefs for FDR. Then you had Nimitz and King. King was the CNO, and Nimitz commanded in the Pacific. Now, somehow or another, with only 7 4-stars, we managed to survive the greatest, most destructive war in history, and fortunately end up on the quote-unquote winning side. Now, we are blessed with 43 to 44 4-stars, organized into multiple commands designed to blanket the globe with American military power and interest. I think it borders on lunacy, especially since we don't live in the world of 1920, 1945. This is the 21st century. Today, if you have forces forward, they're easy to identify, easy to target, easy to destroy. So what's the point of having a lot of forces forward? Well, we can always reinforce them. No, you can't. How do you get across these vast oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific, when your opponents have submarine fleets? How many ships do they have to sink, supply ships, transports, before everybody says, that's it, we're not going? Same thing true for aircraft. Well, we have better aircraft. We may have better aircraft, but we don't have very good air defenses. We've neglected air and missile defenses for years. In the Army, they always treated theater air and missile defense as sort of the redheaded stepchild because we haven't fought anybody that compelled us to defend ourselves from missile and air attack. Well, those days are over. People say, well, what about all the money we spent? That's a damn good question. You spend all this money, what are you getting for it? Where did the money go? Who's making the decisions? And you have separate services. Each service lives in its own world, has its own doctrine, its own bureaucracy, its own way of war. All this jointness is just, fugazi nonsense. And you got lots of generals, and every general has a reason to exist. And every general has 1,000 men in his headquarters, every 4-star. And every 4-star needs money for his projects. And this becomes a giant trough feeding frenzy for people on the Hill.
And he is not just whistling Dixie. I have an article here. This is, let me find the date here, is December 10th, 2024. The Army is too top-heavy, surplus generals, swollen staffs, and excess headquarters drain headcount and resources from war-fighting units. And I'm just going to go, and of course everything in this video will be linked, so you can check it all out yourself. I'd love to hear that I'm wrong. I'm not. Growth in staff and the proliferation of unneeded headquarters is accompanied by the strong tendency to over-officer the force, one factor in the explosion of personnel costs since 9/11. In 2024, 1 in 6 soldiers is a commissioned officer, a 21% increase since 2000. About 1/3 of the Army's personnel budget goes to officer pay and allowances. Between 1965 and 2018, the number of general and flag officers in the U.S. military as a percentage of total force has increased by 46%. Of 4 stars by 114%, 3 stars by 149%. Such deliberate rank inflation and overstaffing contributes to the bureaucratic culture that demands constant reporting from junior commanders, so much so that one authoritative Army War College study found suffocating amounts of mandatory requirements. This leads into another story, because are you getting the best people? Because as we saw with those 2 stories that were right next to each other, more than half of senior Army officers are turning down command consideration. Historically, 85% of these participants were deemed fit for command, yet this year, 54% of the eligible officers voluntarily chose not to participate, in a significant uptick from the 40% opt-out rate in 2019. The predominant reasons: family circumstances, retirement eligibility, and family stabilization. They go further into some of the articles here, into this article, and they talk about just the bureaucracy that goes into it. How you end up, it's a job that is endlessly bureaucratic and responsibility is hanging over your head for not much more. In other cases, lieutenant colonels are reaching the 20-year mark and have decided whether they're going to seek the rank of general or retire. And they retire. So then you get not the best of the best out of a pool of bureaucrats, because it's usually a bureaucrat who is more inclined to try to get to the top of a bureaucracy. So you end up with bureaucrats in charge of bureaucrats in charge of bureaucrats. It's a tragic story. I do believe that the Army is a little too top-heavy. I also believe that most senior officers are turning it down because it's top-heavy. I don't think there's any other way of looking at it. There's a lot of reasons why not to be a star general. There's many reasons to be, of course. Millions of reasons. The old payola. But we're not getting the best of the best. I think that's been proven. These articles show it here. There's a lot more evidence to show that, and we need to change that around. I want to thank you for sitting here and listening to me. Everything will be linked. I appreciate you. That's all I got.